Deep within a cold, obsidian heart lies a secret that has been protected for an entire lifetime from the world. We break through the hard exterior to find the warmth of humanity that still beats within. Hit subscribe now and discover the mysteries hidden in the dark corners.
The moment I knew my director had made the biggest mistake of her career wasn't when the phone rang. It was 3 seconds before that when she turned to face the room with that smile, the one she'd been saving for this exact moment, and said, "This is what happens when people think they're above the process." 52 engineers watched her. Nobody clapped. Nobody nodded. You could hear the ventilation system running overhead. My name is Webb. I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years doing structural quality assurance on commercial and industrial construction projects, bridges, processing plants, grain elevators, the kind of infrastructure that doesn't forgive mistakes. And 4 months ago, I watched my director stand in front of my entire department and feed 2 years of my inspection work into a shredder. What she didn't know was that the VP of operations at our largest client was sitting in his truck in the parking garage below us, on a call with a recruiter specifically about me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got to that conference room, because none of it makes sense without the setup. And the setup, I promise you, is what makes the ending so satisfying. I joined Meridian Structural Group 26 months ago as a senior QA engineer. The company did inspection and compliance work for large-scale commercial builds across the Southeast: hospitals, manufacturing facilities, industrial warehouses, that kind of thing. Good work, meaningful work, the kind where if you cut corners, somebody eventually gets hurt. I came in with a reputation. 22 years in the field, started as an ironworker's apprentice right out of high school in Knoxville, worked my way through welding inspection certification, then structural steel, then full AIC and ICC credentials. I'd done projects in 11 states. I'd flagged issues that other inspectors missed. Twice on projects where catching it early saved significant money and, more importantly, kept workers safe. My new director, Diane Kellner, had been with Meridian for 3 years. Civil engineering degree, 8 years at a consulting firm doing project management, then she'd moved into compliance management on the administrative side. Smart woman. Organized. Very confident in her processes. She'd never actually worked a job site. Not a single day of boots on steel experience. But she had a wall full of process flow charts and a very clear vision of how QA work should be done. Standardized, efficient, billable by the hour at a rate that kept the department's cost per inspection in the target range. She reported upward every quarter. Our first real disagreement came about 3 weeks in, over a precast concrete panel job for a distribution center in Savannah. Routine assignment on paper. I drove out for what was supposed to be a 2-day inspection, standard pre-pour walkthrough and documentation sign-off. On the second morning, I was reviewing the rebar placement on the tilt-up panels, and something didn't sit right. The spacing was within tolerance on paper, but the concrete mix spec and the panel dimensions on this particular section didn't match the load calculations in the structural drawings. Not a glaring error. The kind of thing you'd have to know what you're looking for to catch. I called the structural engineer of record, spent 4 hours on the phone and reviewing revised drawings, then spent another day and a half working through the documentation with the site super to get the correction logged properly before the pour. When I submitted my time, Diane called me into her office. "You were allocated 2 days," she said. She was holding a printed copy of my timesheet. "You submitted 4.5. The panel spec had a discrepancy," I told her. "I caught it before the pour. Getting it corrected on the front end probably saved the client 6 figures in remediation costs, maybe more." She nodded slowly, the way people do when they're not actually listening to what you're saying. "I understand you are being thorough," she said, "but our inspection protocols are designed to be completed within the allocated timeframe. If every engineer took 4.5 days on a 2-day job, we'd lose money on every contract. We'd also not miss structural discrepancies," I said. She made a note on her tablet. "Going forward," she said, "if you anticipate exceeding your allocated hours, you need prior approval. That's the protocol." I walked out of her office and I thought, this is a person who has never been on the other end of a phone call where someone tells you the floor of a building moved. I kept doing my job the way I knew how to do it. And because I'd been in the field as long as I had, I wasn't slow. I was just thorough in the places that mattered. I knew which details to drill down on and which ones were genuinely fine. That meant I caught things other inspectors missed and our clients noticed. The first one to really notice was Ray Doucette. Ray ran Doucette Industrial, a mid-sized company that built and managed processing facilities for food and agricultural clients across Louisiana and Mississippi. He'd been a Meridian client for 4 years, but the relationship had been frustrating. Generic inspection reports, slow turnaround, and a sense that whoever was assigned to his jobs didn't actually understand the specific requirements of food-grade processing environments. I got assigned to one of his jobs in Baton Rouge, a cold storage expansion at a poultry processing facility. 2-day walkthrough, standard inspection package. On the first day, I noticed something in the drainage system spec that was going to cause problems. Not a structural issue. A drainage slope calculation that met generic commercial building code but wasn't sufficient for the sanitation requirements of a USDA-inspected facility. If they'd built it to spec and open for operation, they'd have had pooling in the processing floor and a federal compliance problem within the first inspection cycle. It wasn't my job to catch that. My job was structural QA, but I've been around long enough to know that a problem is a problem, and pointing it out costs nothing. I flagged it, called Ray directly, walked him through what I'd found and why it mattered. He got his mechanical engineer on the phone. We worked through a correction. It added most of a day to my time on site. Ray called Meridian the next morning and asked specifically that I be assigned to all his future jobs. When I told Diane about the drainage issue, she was quiet for a moment. "That wasn't in your scope," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it would have been a significant problem for the client." "The drainage system is the mechanical engineer's responsibility," she said. "We're structural QA. When we start inserting ourselves into other disciplines, we create liability exposure, and we blur the scope of our contracts." I looked at her. Ray called and specifically requested me. "I know," she said, "but the reason it takes you a day longer than protocol isn't something we can scale. If our inspection reports start incorporating out-of-scope observations, we're going to have contracts renegotiated and liability questions we're not equipped to handle." It struck me then that Diane's actual job, as she understood it, was not to ensure quality outcomes on job sites. Her job was to keep the department's numbers clean, so that the quarterly report she sent upstairs looked the way it was supposed to look. Over the following year, I built real relationships with 4 or 5 clients who'd started specifically requesting my work. Ray at Doucette Industrial had extended his contract and added 2 new facilities to our scope. A regional hospital system in Birmingham had brought us in on a major expansion after I caught a steel connection issue during a routine inspection that could have caused serious problems during high wind events. A cold storage company in Memphis had tripled their annual contract after I redesigned how we approached their inspection sequencing to eliminate costly reinspection cycles. Every time Diane's response was some variation of the same theme: "You exceeded your hours, you went outside your scope, you're not following the protocol." Every time I showed her the revenue the client relationship had generated. Every time she nodded and made a note, she'd been building a file on me. I didn't know it then, but I found out later. Every deviation from protocol, every exceeded allocation, every time I'd incorporated an out-of-scope observation into a report, documented. She was assembling a case. The thing that triggered the final confrontation was a job for a new client. A pharmaceutical manufacturing facility outside Huntsville, Alabama. Big contract. First job we'd done with them. High visibility internally because the VP of operations at the pharmaceutical company, a man named Dale Kaufman, had specifically come to us based on a referral from Ray Doucette. Diane assigned me a 3-day inspection window. I showed up Monday morning, spent the first day doing the structural walkthrough, and by Tuesday afternoon I had identified something that kept me from sleeping that night. The facility had a second-floor equipment mezzanine, heavy pharmaceutical processing equipment, serious load. The connection details between the mezzanine framing and the main structural system were built as designed, and the design was stamped and approved. But when I pulled the original soil boring data from the geotechnical report and cross-referenced it against the foundation system that had been built, there was a discrepancy. The soil conditions in one corner of the building were weaker than the borings had indicated they would be, and the foundation in that area hadn't been adjusted to account for it. Was the building going to fall down tomorrow? No. Was there a potential long-term settlement issue that, combined with the equipment loads on that mezzanine, could create a serious structural problem over time? Yes. Absolutely yes. I spent 2 days working through it. I contacted the structural engineer of record, got another geotechnical firm involved for a secondary review, documented everything meticulously. By the time I submitted my findings, I'd been on site 5 days instead of 3, and my report was 61 pages long. Dale Kaufman called me personally. He said the kind of things people say when they realize they narrowly avoided a very bad outcome. He was grateful. He was also worried, and we had a long conversation about what remediation might look like and what the timeline was going to be. He trusted me. When I presented the report internally, Diane's first question was about the hours. "You were allocated 3 days," she said. "You submitted 5. "The foundation issue required a secondary geotechnical review," I said. "You engaged an outside firm without authorization," she said. "That's a procurement violation. I needed a second opinion before I could make a responsible recommendation. That decision wasn't yours to make. You should have flagged the concern to me and let me determine whether an outside review was warranted." I thought about what that would have meant. I flag it to Diane. Diane runs it up the chain. Someone decides whether the expense is justified. Meanwhile, the client is already beginning equipment installation on that mezzanine. Days pass. "With respect," I said. "If I'd waited for internal approval, the client would have had $500,000 of pharmaceutical equipment installed over a foundation problem." Diane set down her pen. "Marcus, I've been documenting your pattern of going outside protocol for over a year. What you've produced has generated some client goodwill, I'll acknowledge that. But you've also created liability exposure with the outside firm engagement, and you've set expectations with clients that we cannot sustain with our current staffing model. I'm placing you on a formal performance improvement plan." A performance improvement plan. For catching a foundation problem. I went home that night and I told my wife what had happened. She's been married to an engineer for 23 years. She knows exactly what kind of work I do and what the stakes are. She said about 4 words before I finished my sentence, and they were not printable, and they were directed at Diane. The PIP ran for 60 days. During that time, I followed every protocol exactly as written. 3-day jobs took 3 days. Reports covered structural scope and nothing else. I didn't make a single call to an outside firm, didn't have a single conversation with a client that went beyond the narrow lane I'd been assigned. Dale Kaufman reached out twice during those 60 days. Both times I had to refer him to the account manager. I could hear the frustration in his voice the second time, not at me, but at the situation. I found out later that he'd made inquiries during that period, asking around in his professional network about structural QA firms that took a more thorough approach. I didn't know that at the time. The 60-day review meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-February. Diane had arranged for our department head, a man named Richard Cho, to be present. She'd also arranged for 11 other senior engineers in the department to attend what she called a process alignment discussion. I walked in knowing something was wrong. You develop a sense for those rooms after enough years. Diane had a presentation up on the screen. It was titled Quality Assurance Protocol Standards Department Review, and it was, front to back, a dismantling of every non-standard decision I'd made in the previous 2 years. She went through it methodically. The Savannah job where I'd added 2 days, the Baton Rouge drainage flag, the Birmingham connection detail. Each one presented as an example of scope creep, resource misallocation, and protocol deviation. The 61-page Huntsville report was the centerpiece, presented as an example of unauthorized vendor engagement and unilateral decision-making. She had printed copies of my time submissions. She had internal emails I'd sent flagging concerns. She'd even pulled the outside geotechnical firm's invoice and highlighted the cost. What she did not include anywhere in that presentation was a single outcome. Not the avoided costs, not the client retention numbers, not the fact that Dale Kaufman had referred 2 additional pharmaceutical clients to Meridian based on the Huntsville work, not the fact that Ray Doucette's contracts had grown by nearly $200,000 annually. The room was uncomfortable. I could see it on people's faces, engineers who knew what the work actually looked like, who understood what catching a foundation discrepancy actually meant. Then Diane pulled up a shared drive folder on the main screen. It had my name on it. Part of today's discussion, she said, is establishing that the documentation Marcus has accumulated under his individual client folders cannot serve as a model for department practice. The approach represented here is not scalable, not consistent with our protocols, and frankly creates a misleading benchmark for what a standard inspection should produce. She opened the folder. She selected everything. She looked at the room. "We're going to reset the baseline," she said. She hit delete. 61 pages of foundation analysis, client communication records, remediation recommendations, 2 years of field documentation that had, quietly and without much fanfare, kept several buildings safer than they would otherwise have been. Gone. The room was silent in a way that felt physical. One of the engineers 2 seats down from me, a woman named Priya who'd been with the company for 8 years, looked at the table. She didn't look up for a long time. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I don't normally answer during meetings. I don't know why I looked. Maybe because the room felt like it was closing in and I needed somewhere to put my eyes. The name on the screen was Dale Kaufman. I looked up. Diane was still talking. Something about establishing consistent documentation standards going forward. Richard Cho was nodding slowly. I said, "Excuse me," quietly. The way you say it when you're not asking. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Marcus," Dale said. He didn't waste any time. "I'm going to cut straight to it. I've been in contact with a firm called Consolidated Engineering Partners for the last 6 weeks. They're building a QA division for industrial and pharmaceutical construction, and they want someone to run it. I told them I knew exactly who they should talk to. They've been trying to reach you through back channels. I told them I'd call you myself." He paused. "I know you're still at Meridian. I also know from what I'm hearing that the situation there has gotten complicated. Are you in a position to have a conversation?" I stood in that hallway and I looked back through the narrow window in the conference room door. Diane was still presenting. Nobody was looking at the screen anymore. "Yes," I said. "I'm very much in a position to have a conversation." The offer came 2 days later. Director of Quality Assurance with full authority over inspection methodology and team standards. The compensation was $320,000 annually, plus benefits and a performance incentive tied to client retention. Nearly double what I was making at Meridian. More importantly, the firm's founding principle was that thorough, client-specific inspection work was the only sustainable business model in high-stakes construction. They built the entire company around the opposite of what Diane had spent 2 years trying to enforce. I submitted my resignation the following Monday. I wrote it professionally and I kept it short. I thanked the company for the time. I did not explain. Diane called me into her office within an hour. "I want to understand what's driving this," she said. She was very calm. Too calm. The way people are when they're trying to figure out their exposure. "It's a better opportunity," I said, aligned with how I approach the work. "Marcus, I want to be direct with you. Your PIP review was actually trending toward a positive resolution. I was prepared to remove the formal documentation at the end of the cycle." I looked at her. "You deleted 2 years of my work in front of the entire department," I said. "In front of Priya, who's been here 8 years and knows exactly what that documentation represented." She didn't have an answer for that. "I genuinely hope the department does well," I said, and I mostly meant it. I spent my last 2 weeks on administrative tasks only, no field work. On my final day, Priya stopped by my desk. She'd been with Meridian a long time, and she had 3 kids and a mortgage and a husband who'd been out of work for a year. She wasn't in a position to make moves. She knew that, and I knew that. "You're going to land well," she said. She wasn't asking. "The Huntsville report," I told her quietly. "The foundation analysis." I kept a personal copy on my home drive. The methodology, the geotechnical cross-reference approach, the documentation structure, if you ever need it for your own work, not for Meridian, you call me. She nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. What happened over the following months, I want to be careful about how I describe, because I didn't orchestrate any of it. I took the job at Consolidated. I updated my professional profiles. I kept working the way I'd always worked. Dale Kaufman transferred his company's QA contracts to Consolidated Engineering within 6 weeks of my start date. He didn't make a dramatic announcement about it. He simply didn't renew with Meridian when the cycle came up, and when Meridian's account manager called to discuss renewal terms. Dale's assistant said he'd be working with another firm going forward. Ray Doucette followed 3 months later, along with 2 other clients from his referral network. I didn't call any of them. I want to be clear about that. They called me. The work I'd done on their facilities was still there. The drainage fix in Baton Rouge, the connection detail in Birmingham, the foundation remediation in Huntsville. Those outcomes didn't disappear when Diane deleted the files. They existed in the buildings. They existed in what my clients knew about how I'd handled their problems. You can delete a report. You cannot delete the fact that a processing facility has been running clean inspections for 2 years because someone caught a drainage slope error before the concrete was poured. I heard things through the professional network over the following months. Meridian lost 4 major clients in a 12-month period. The revenue impact was significant enough that they restructured the QA department. Richard Cho took early retirement. Diane Killner was not retained when the restructuring was complete. I don't take satisfaction in that the way maybe I once thought I would. The satisfaction, when I'm honest about it, is simpler than that. It's going into work on a Monday morning and being asked to review an approach to a problem and having people actually want my answer. It's being in a room where the conversation is about what's right for the building and the people who use it, not about what fits within a 3-day allocation. It's field work. It's what I've always done. My daughter is studying civil engineering. She's in her 3rd year at Georgia Tech and she's very good. Last Thanksgiving she was asking me about QA work, whether it was interesting, whether it paid, whether she should consider it as a specialization. I told her the technical answer, yes to all 3. Then I told her the other thing. I said, in this work, you are going to have moments where you find something that nobody asked you to find, on a job where you were only supposed to be looking at something else. And the right call is going to cost you time you weren't allocated and possibly get you into a conversation with a supervisor who does not want to hear it. And in those moments, you have to remember that the building doesn't care about your allocation. The building doesn't care about the quarterly report. 18 years from now, when something is still standing the way it's supposed to be standing, it won't be because somebody had a clean timesheet. She nodded. She's smart enough that I didn't need to say the rest, but here's the rest. Because it's true and it matters, the people who build those buildings, the ones doing the work, the site supers and the iron workers and the foremen who've been at it for 20 years, they know the difference. They know within 5 minutes of meeting you whether you understand the work or whether you're reading off a protocol sheet. And if you understand the work, they'll talk to you. They'll tell you things they'd never put in an email. And sometimes those conversations are exactly how you find the thing you weren't supposed to find. That's the job. That's always been the job. Sometimes you have to lose the file to prove that the knowledge was never in the file to begin with. People ask me sometimes if I regret any of it. The extra days on the Savannah job. The drainage call in Baton Rouge that wasn't technically my scope. The 5 days I spent in Huntsville cross-referencing soil borings while Diane was building a file on me 2 states away. And honestly, the answer is no. Not because everything worked out fine, though it did, but because I don't think outcomes are really the right measure for those kinds of decisions. Here's what I've come to understand about the 2 years I spent at Meridian. Diane wasn't wrong that I was difficult to manage. I consistently exceeded my allocations. I engaged an outside firm without authorization. I flagged issues that weren't in my inspection scope. From a process standpoint, she had a legitimate case against me. The thing she never grasped, the thing that ultimately cost her the job and the department and the client relationships, was that process isn't the point. Process is supposed to serve the point. When it stops doing that, you have to be honest enough to say so, even when saying so is inconvenient. I think about the foundation in Huntsville a lot. That building is operating right now. Pharmaceutical equipment running on a mezzanine that was remediated correctly because someone spent 2 extra days doing a cross-reference that nobody asked for. The people who work in that facility don't know my name. They'll never know my name, but the floor holds the way it's supposed to hold, and that's a fact that exists completely independent of whether Diane deleted the report or not. She deleted the file. She did not delete the outcome. That's the thing about real work, the kind that requires you to actually understand what you're doing. It leaves marks that aren't stored in folders. Ray's facility in Baton Rouge has been running clean inspections for 2 years because a drainage slope got corrected before the concrete was poured. That correction lives in the concrete. It's not going anywhere. What I had to learn, and I'm still learning it honestly, is the difference between stubbornness and integrity. Stubbornness is refusing to change because change is uncomfortable. Integrity is refusing to change the things that actually matter, even when someone with authority over you is telling you to. Diane wanted me to be less thorough. She had legitimate sounding reasons, and I had to be willing to accept the professional consequences of disagreeing with her without knowing in advance how the story would end. I didn't know Dale was going to call. I didn't know consolidated existed. I just knew that agreeing with Diane meant doing work I couldn't stand behind, and I wasn't willing to do that. My daughter is 3 years out from working in this field. When I think about what I actually want her to take from what happened to me, it's not the 320K, though I'd be lying if I said the number didn't feel like a validation in that particular moment. What I want her to understand is that competence is patient. The people who benefit from your work remember even when the documentation is gone, even when you've moved on, even when the person who tried to erase your contribution is no longer in the building. The results are still there, in the structures, in the relationships, in the trust that was built one honest conversation at a time. You build a reputation the same way you build anything that's meant to last. You do it correctly, even when no one is checking. Especially when no one is checking. And when someone tries to knock it down in front of 52 people to make a point about protocol, the only thing they actually demonstrate is that they never understood what they were looking at.